take much. Dr. Siyabalapitiya presently working as an international energy consultant. Before that, Dr. Siyabalapitiya worked as a chief engineer in Ceylon Electricity Board and principal engineer at Saudi Consolidated Electrical Company. And he has worked in many committees and many national level and international level committees, including for the Ministry of Power and Energy, Sri Lanka. And he has experience in consulting and in tariff analysis in Sri Lanka, as well as in East African countries like Tanzania. And most of his studies for Sri Lankan government has been done in honorary basis, and most of significant from a lot of his work. I will highlight some of his assignments. In 2013, he worked for the Renewable Energy Policy Committee. And in 2005, he worked for the committee to review the power sector reforms. And in 2004 to 2008, he worked for the National Energy Policy Committee. And between 2005 and 8, he worked for the renewable energy groups in Sri Lanka. And he continues teaching for the master degrees in Sri Lanka and also contributing editor of Sri Lanka Energy Audit Manual in 2009, 1999 and 2000 and 2013. Without much taking your time, I'll invite Dr. Siyabalapitiya to address our audience on the title, Managing Conflicting Expectation from Electricity Utility Industry in Sri Lanka's case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tushara, and good evening to all of you again. And thank you for inviting me for this guest lecture. I understand that somewhat of a majority of my participants are students, but that does not prevent anybody else joining either. So therefore, with that mindset, I have prepared my presentation on the topic that has been given to me, which is managing conflicting expectations from the utility industry, electric utility industry, the case of Sri Lanka. So the information that I will present are largely taken from published documents, as well as my own and our own analysis, our group in our company, plus my students at various universities have from time to time assisted me in this analysis. And of course, I take responsibility for all the information that is presented here. So let me start off by sharing my presentation. By now, the presentation must be visible to you. And I've been told that after this discussion session, the presentation will be provided to all of you if you have requested that. So let me move on. So I started off with a cover page picture of a distribution line, because almost 1/2 of my time allocated today, I want to focus on the emerging problems on the distribution network. Many might think that Sri Lanka has a super distribution network, but the data proves otherwise. Sri Lanka's distribution engineering and the distribution network are, in my view, have started a process in the reverse direction. So after that statement, let me move on with my slides. I started off saying in the brochure as well, the national grid is 70 years old. So the national grid was established approximately in 1950. And between 1950 and today, there have been very significant improvements. By 1950, most likely, all of Europe and all of USA had electricity delivered to almost 95% of households. Sri Lanka's figure was almost 5% 70 years ago, and thus began the task of developing the national grid and larger scale generators to serve the national grid and developing and expanding the distribution network. So the present day situation at a high level or at a macro level, what we see is that there are some gains, but in our rush to achieve some targets and to be the first in doing this, that, and the other, we seem to be neglecting the fundamentals of the electric utility business. I tend to call it a business because the electric utility industry is no longer a service. Because if it is a service, then most likely we will not be able to manage the quality and the quantity of supply that we have at the moment. So I tend to call it a business, but in Sri Lanka, as we know, it's a government-owned business. So instead of neglecting the important features of a utility industry and consolidating them, what we see here is an erosion of the traditional values and some of the gains that have been recorded over a difficult period of 70 years. Now, what are the high-level attributes of a good utility industry? High level means, I would say, macro level, or what are the summary attributes of a good utility industry? Of course, we can simply summarize them with 4 bullet points. Technical quality, that is the quality of electricity supply, and the commercial quality. Perhaps you may not be familiar with this term, commercial quality. Commercial quality in day-to-day experience, I would say, if you get your electricity bill on time, if you are treated well when you visit an office, you ask for a new connection, you get it in 3 days, and your inquiries are seriously attended to. These are features of commercial quality. Economic cooperation. So that means all the stakeholders, which means the suppliers, the operators, and the customers are running a viable business. So that means, of course, it has a lot of very wide meaning. The suppliers should be, in my view, profit making. The operators should be profit making. The customers should be getting a product at a price that is regionally competitive or internationally competitive, so that this product, which is called electricity, can be used by the customers and add value to their services or products in their office, the IT company, or the manufacturing industry, and sell their services and products to the international market, so that the customers are not disadvantaged owing to poor technical quality, poor commercial quality, or poor pricing. Of course, electricity being a dangerous commodity, safety is also part of a good attribute of a good utility industry. So these are the macro level attributes, but we will get on to some more practical attributes, which I would like to call them slogans. So, what are the expectations of an electricity industry, direct and indirect, as seen by a customer or a stakeholder, a politician, a person who sees that there is some activity going on, what do I need or what do I can expect from the utility industry? So obviously, the network to cover the whole country. The network to cover the whole country. Of course, already there are people who say that people will be deserting the grid, but most likely it will remain. The grid will remain for quite some time into the future, with some changes and modifications, so that it will bind the suppliers and the customers together for quite several decades to come. But what I'm talking here is about the coverage of the country. We will get into details later on. Reduce losses, improve reliability. So these are features of technical quality. Reduce prices, provide subsidies. So most of the stakeholders, both the electricity producers and customers, are asking for a variety of subsidies. So electricity producers are asking for favorable treatment, tax reduction, attractive buyback prices. Customers are asking for reduced prices, subsidies, if possible, free electricity. So these are the conflicting demands on a utility industry, which in my view, Sri Lanka has not been able to manage efficiently. These conflicting demands are not unique only to Sri Lanka, but there are countries who are managing these conflicting demands more efficiently than Sri Lanka has been able to. What are the other slogans that we are hearing of? Increase renewables, reduce fossil fuel use, reduce the carbon footprint, be carbon neutral by such and such a year. Of course, provide employment and follow government policies. At a lower operational level, please connect my solar rooftop. I want a zero bill, or suppliers promising that your bill will be zero. And a customer saying, attend to my power outage. I cannot wait. I cannot wait. I cannot stand even a minute without the electricity supply being on. So these are the expectations of various stakeholders. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes to tell you what is the status of the high level expectations and some micro and macro level expectations of the electricity utility industry. Give me an electricity connection. So how are we faring? Maybe the younger generation amongst us may be surprised to see this blue curve, which should be read on the right-hand side axis. Sri Lanka had only 5% of the households with electricity in 1970. You will be surprised even when we crossed the millennium, we were still at 60%. So nothing great to boast about, with 40% of the households in the country without electricity. And the red line gives the population. So if you multiply 60% with a population of approximately 18 million, about 5.5 million in the country, people were without electricity at home. Of course, some of them were working in factories, some of them were attending schools or universities who may not have electricity at home, but they enjoy the benefits of electricity where they study or work. Of course, sometime in year 2016, the government declared that 100% electrification has been achieved. Of course, this figure of 100% is disputed because still there are pockets or individual households in certain areas which do not have an electricity connection. So I will not argue with whether it's 100% or 99.5%, but we are certainly above 99%. So 99% or above is acceptable to be equivalent to 100% electrification. So that has been achieved in 2016. Hopefully that will not be an achievement that will ever be reversed. And in fact, the regulators or policymakers or policy advocates are actually talking about a situation where even the connection fees will be abolished in time to come. Presently, if you ask for an electricity connection, you have to pay for your service drop. But if we have a very well planned urban and rural development system, we should be able to make sure that every customer who asks for a new connection, maybe for his new house, for new factory, extension to his factory, is already included in the urban planning, and therefore he does not have to pay an additional connection fee for so many meters of line to reach his new house or to his new factory. So I personally visualize the day that it will happen, but not yet because of various constraints. So achievement. I also came across this very interesting piece of data. Although we say that 100% households are electrified, virtually whole country is electrified. Would you believe that 6.6% of these households are closed? They are not using any electricity. And I have traced snapshots in particular months over the last almost 18 years. And the share of households that are shut down have actually increased to reach a maximum, according to the data that I have access to. The maximum in the range of data I have is 7.3% in 2017. And just before the pandemic, February 2020, the figure has dropped to 6.6%, but 6.5% of households in this country who are registered electricity users, they are paying the monthly minimum fee. They are not solar PV customers who are not purchasing from the grid. They are customers who are using zero electricity, not drawing anything from the grid, but the fixed charge is being paid and have an active account. So I have to assume that these households are closed for whatever reason, waiting for the next tenant or a second house for some of the people some of whom may be living abroad. So, but this is the reality of the situation. So, and this is of course CEB data only. LECO may have a similar profile, but I had access only to CEB data. Then another feature, it's still largely related to distribution. This is a success story as well as this is a major worry. You will see what this shows is the energy loss in the transmission and distribution network over the last 5 years ending in 2020. So the blue bar represents the expected loss of the transmission network as a share of generation. The red bar is the expected loss of the distribution network for the whole country, not only CEB, but CEB, LECO, medium voltage, low voltage, distribution, transformers, everything put together. The expected loss. So the loss was expected to decline over the 5 years from 12% in 2016 to 7.5% by 2020. The performance for the first 2 years was good, and 2018 was touch and go, as you see. And 2019 the achievements were flat, no reductions, and 2020 the losses went up. Losses as a percent went up. In an electricity supply network, which is supplying more energy of the same network, and a developed network cannot have losses coming down and increasing again. So are we seeing the reversal of 70 years of gains? 20 years ago, the losses were 20%. 20 years ago, in year 2000, the losses were 20%. So there were quite a lot of technical losses, perhaps an equal amount of commercial losses. Commercial loss, as I say, is a respectable word for theft or absence of meters or bad metering, meter tampering, hooking distribution lines with illegal connections. All these are classified as commercial loss. So these gains over the last 18 years, which helped us to bring our total network loss to a regional best of 8.8% as of 2019, suddenly got reversed in 2020, running up to 9.45%. So this is a worrying factor. Some of you might think that this may be attributed to the COVID-related absence of meters or meter reading delays, etc. But I cannot agree with that, because this data represents a situation of the whole year up to December. So although there were lapses, there would have been delays and lapses in reading the meters. By December, almost all of that was corrected, was rectified. So therefore, this represents the true situation. And I'm almost certain that this increase of almost 1%, okay, less than 1%, but say 0.6% could be attributed to commercial losses caused by theft. So therefore, this has to be controlled. This has to be investigated in great detail, because loss is an important parameter. Because if we do not manage a loss, we are not engineering the power system. Because a power system has to be engineered. You just cannot draw lines here and there and say this is it. The transmission network has to be engineered to be economically optimum, and the distribution network also has to be engineered to be economically optimum. So therefore, when the loss increases, we cannot simply say that it happened so. And that's the reason why already Sri Lanka is reporting losses to the second decimal point. As you see, all losses are reported to the second decimal point, because once you start racing towards a target to reduce your losses, it's not enough to say it's 10% or 8% or 9%. We have to go not only to the first decimal place, but to the second decimal place, and keep on refining the numbers, the targets, the calculations. But for your information, as I have shown here, the loss of 1% of energy in our system is worth about 2,000 million rupees a year. So if you consider last year, the loss of about 0.6% of energy is worth about 1,200 million rupees last year. So somebody has to pay that 1,200 million rupees last year just for the increase of losses. And who pays that? It will be paid by 6.7 million customers of CEB and LECO. Maybe directly, maybe indirectly, but someday, somewhere, you will pay that. So therefore, it's not a small amount, as you can imagine. It's not a small amount on your bill when simply the loss goes up. Forget about the target. Target is further down. The target for 2020 was 7.5. The achievement was 9.45. So therefore, the grid has missed the loss target by almost 2%. Almost 2%. So therefore, the additional burden is of the order of 4,000 million rupees a year as of 2020. So this is a dangerous trend, and this has to be examined both from an engineering and a commercial point of view. So this is a challenge because 4,000 million rupees of money is really not a small amount of money, because as we know, that is about $20 million. If you want to think in international terms, that's about $20 million. And in a country where dollars are very scarce these days, $20 million is not small. We move on. So how can losses be reduced? What can be the targets for 2025? So, of course, investments on upgrades. But as I would explain later, where is the money to do the upgrades? Replacement of aging assets. Certain assets, when they grow old, they become lossy. Once again, where is the money? Then, of course, diligent monitoring of the network. Good metering, meter monitoring, and regular balance, energy balance at the distribution level. So good monitoring of inputs and outputs to the network is required to try and reverse this trend and move the grid back to a declining trend of network losses. My second question is related to the list of expectations of stakeholders. Is the electricity supply becoming more reliable? Each one of you may have your own view. I also have my own view, but as engineers, we go by statistics, we go by data, and then we start probing the data. We generally, since some of you are students, we generally do not go by hearsay, by which I mean, oh, I have a friend in Nugegoda, he said there are a lot of power outages in Nugegoda. So we don't go by such slogans. Maybe they are useful, but that's how the media covers the subject of reliability. But we go by the data. So this is reliability data for the CEB network and the LECO network shown separately. 2014 to 2019, the CEB started publishing the reliability data only after 2017. So I would rather rely on the published data than unpublished information. So therefore, system average interruption duration index, hours per connected customer. So you are a customer, I am a customer. So the average of customer outage duration for 2017 for CEB customers has been 77 hours per year. So for 77 hours, you have not had electricity. LECO figure is not very different. It was 70 hours for 2017. CEB figure has increased. LECO figure has also increased. This is a dangerous situation because LECO in 2015 reported only half the total duration that it reported for 2019. Of course, the trippings SAIFI, SAIFI refer to the system average interruption frequency index. How many times did power fail? So, of course, CEB says it's much lower than LECO's. This is published data. It's not, this data possibly is not independently audited, or the financial data is independently audited, but still that is also increasing. LECO is tripping their customers 117 times a year. Obviously, all of these are not planned trippings. The last line of the notes that I give here are also important for the students in my audience, in that some countries report their reliability data on the basis of 1 minute or longer. So Sri Lanka data counts all trippings which are 1 minute or longer. In case you compare this data with some international figures, including in USA, their definition to count an outage into the calculation of annual outage duration is that the outage must last for 5 minutes or more. So therefore, we have to be cautious. In a way, I would say CEB and LECO are more stringent in their reporting, or I would say in a way more honest in their reporting. 1 minute or more is included in the reporting system. Reporting system to report reliability data, statistics. But of course, as a customer, you can report even if it is half a minute. That's your right. But if there's a half a minute outage, it does not get into this statistic. In most countries, as I said, that outage has to be 5 minutes or more to get into this statistic. So don't be alarmed by some country showing just 10 trippings and 3 hours of outage. So it could be that their reporting standard is different. But overall, Sri Lanka has been reporting on the same standard for the last so many years, and the reliability is declining. Reliability indices are increasing. So therefore, this is a worrying trend which has to be arrested. So the unreliability is in distribution. Unreliability comes from medium voltage and low voltage distribution lines. It is not grid instability or load shedding or blackouts, power cuts. No, I think our society has a general term called power cut, which is usually a blackout, intentional or unintentional, or a maintenance outage. But these reliability statistics, of course, includes everything, but most of which are related to outages in the distribution network. Outages of the transmission network are rare. So what has to be done? Investment on upgrades, distribution SCADA and distribution automation. So many countries, including developing countries, have moved on to good automation of the distribution network, increasing the redundancy in the distribution network. In transmission, redundancy is good. That's why I say transmission outages are much less. No transmission line is loaded to more than 50% of its capacity. So that if the parallel line fails, the solo transmission line can deliver the output. But in distribution, we do not have it. So therefore, there has to be redundancy brought into distribution. Until we get into redundancy, which requires investment, we can think of some amount of distribution automation. So when a distribution medium voltage feeder trips, it will be automatically identified and an alternative feeding arrangement will automatically come in. Technologically, not difficult at all, but there is a lot of engineering to be done there. Efficient management of outages, efficient management, quick attention to outages. Of course, the ultimate will be to go for underground distribution. So if you look at these figures, although the national figure is 110, I am told that the figure for the city of Colombo is about 5 hours. And this figure, the number of outages for the city of Colombo in the underground network is about 3 for the year. So therefore, undergrounding the network definitely has very significant advantages of planned and unplanned outages of distribution network. But again, the question I ask is, where is the money to do that? The money should come from customers themselves. And perhaps improvement of what we have in the present, because the moment I tell you underground distribution, the question that comes to mind is that it's bad enough the water board digging most of the roads and telecom digging most of the roads in the country, and now comes CB also digging the roads outside the city of Colombo. So therefore, our undergrounding solution should go along with utility corridors. So which means along each roadway, there will be a utility corridor shared by the several utilities, not only water board, electricity suppliers, as well as telecoms, many companies, plus water supply and sewage as well. So presently 4 or maybe 5 in certain areas, the utility suppliers will share a common corridor. Once again, where is the money to do that? I will try to answer that question as we go on. So, of course, what this picture shows is what the household customers in Sri Lanka paid last year as of September 2020 in comparison with what other similar customers paid in other countries in the region. And India being a large country, I've studied several states of India. So there is always this argument that electricity is cheaper in that country, this country, and whatever other country. But then, because the electricity pricing systems are somewhat complicated, there's no better way than comparing the prices of electricity by defining a customer and hypothetically placing that customer in each one of these countries. So if there was a customer using 90 kilowatt hour per month in Sri Lanka, that customer, as of last year, and the pricing is the same this year, but the exchange rate has changed. But as of September 2020, he would be paying about 5 US cents per kilowatt hour. The same customer, if he was in Thailand, would pay double the price for electricity. Double the price for electricity. And same with Maharashtra, India, Madhya Pradesh, India, Nepal, a country that is of the size of Sri Lanka and 100% renewable energy country. So he is asked to pay about 20% more than what a Sri Lankan pays. So of course, countries that offer cheaper electricity are Pakistan, Oman, and Bhutan. Bhutan is 100% hydro. And Tamil Nadu, India, for low customers, low user customers, they have a preferential price. To give you about where we are placed and the need to look at the issue of pricing rationally, because the society appears to be expecting electricity for free. But when you look at the data, as I will show later, the data do not show that the customers are asking for free electricity. I will come to that in a moment after completing the regional comparison of electricity prices for manufacturing industry. So he is a manufacturing industry, my hypothetical factory, using 65,000 kilowatt hour per month. This is a medium scale industry. So let us assume that it's a barrel factory with 200 employees. That's the order of magnitude. So Sri Lanka's prices are in the middle of the range. Thailand is about 50% more, and even Tamil Nadu is 50% more. And the countries that offer anything cheaper are in my comparison, Oman and Bhutan. Of course, the reasons are very clear. And I have one developed country in my group. That's a state in Canada, which provides electricity cheaper than Sri Lanka. Of course, Canada has a lot of hydropower and coal power and nuclear power. and a lot of gas imports as well. So therefore, it's understandable that electricity is sold in bulk at a much cheaper rate than the same country sells electricity to households. So if you are a household in Canada, electricity price is 14. If you are an industry, it's 6. I'm not surprised because bulk purchase of electricity is cheaper because much of the cost of electricity is to distribute it and take it to the customer's doorstep. So a ratio of 1:2 between a bulk customer and a retail customer is understandable. We move on. Finally, I've done a comparison of the commercial customers. Commercial customers they seem to be paying their dues. In fact, out of the customer groups, only Hong Kong and Maharashtra, India seems to be charging more than Sri Lanka from a bulk commercial customer. For example, the smaller scale supermarket using about 2,000 kilowatt hours a day, 58,000 kilowatt hour per month, and this is the bill for a commercial customer. So disparities in pricing. Having said that, the case of households receiving subsidies. So how do customers use electricity? I'm focusing only on households. When analyzing the information available, I came across this feature. What does it say? I've taken some snapshots, June 2014, July 2017, February 2020. And what do these bars indicate? Customers using 1 to 30 kilowatt hours a month. As you know very well, that is the first block in which electricity is very cheap at 2 rupees 50 cents. The first 30 kilowatt hours per month. So I looked at how many customers are in the first block. They must be really low user, low income customers. Some of them could have other reasons to be a low user. Say, for example, the house owners are away and just some security lights are working. So such customers, such households, which are not fully closed down, but some consumption is there, are also in this group. And the second one is the next block, 31 to 60. And the next block, 61 to 90. So true, it is a feature that 78% of the households in this country use less than 90 kilowatt hour. As you know, 90 kilowatt hour is not a large amount of electricity. Possibly only some of them would have a refrigerator in the house. Because if you have a refrigerator, possibly you use about the minimum of 35 kilowatt hours a month for the refrigerator. So anybody who is using a refrigerator and still managing with 90 kilowatt hour wishes to be congratulated for the energy efficiency of his appliances and his pattern of electricity use. But what are we seeing from year to year? 2014 to 2017, the share of customers in each low user block has come down. So 20% of customers were in the first block, and that figure has come down to about 16%. If we do a comparison at 90 kilowatt hour, it was a 78% and now down to 70%. In some of these blocks, the actual number of customers, physical number of customers are reducing. So what do these customers do? They migrate upstairs to the higher user block. So what do those customers say? The customers must be saying, or rather indicating, that I can afford a higher electricity bill. So affordability is increasing. And this indicates because the last electricity price declaration was in 2014. So for 7 years, we have not had a change in electricity price. So no change in electricity price, people's income has increased. So people are consuming more and they are willing to pay more. Some of these changes to block involve a very substantial increase in monthly electricity bill. So this kind of analysis should be further analyzed and perhaps a survey to be conducted to examine whether these customers and what is their willingness to pay without making assumptions, sadly, to assume that the customers are unwilling to pay. Because if we do not charge the cost that they are willing to pay, that means we are not collecting enough money to improve the reliability that is worsening, to reduce the losses that are worsening, and to improve the network in many other aspects. We'll come to such features later. This is the same data, but what it shows, consumption data, energy data. It shows the energy data. So the amount of energy that is used by subsidized customers, say for example, let us say, in fact, if you calculate in terms of numbers, everybody up to here is subsidized. But the largest subsidy are coming to customers below 90 kilowatt hour. So with the price remaining fixed and the inflation in the country running in the range of about 5 to 6% over the last 7 years, 60% of energy in the households were used by people who use less than 90, and that figure has come down to 51%. So people are saying, I don't want your subsidized electricity. I'm willing to pay more. And they have migrated upstairs. They have migrated upstairs to high user brackets. So these are features that have to be analyzed further. Now, of course, the cost and price of electricity has not been equal in the recent past. And here is a comparison of year 2011 and year 2019 second half. So why I selected year 2019 second half is because the regulatory information by the Public Utilities Commission is published on a half-yearly basis. So 2019 second half was the latest that I had when I prepared this slide. But very recently, they have published 2020 as well. But strictly speaking, 2021 also should have been published by now. So unfortunately, electricity cost and price in Sri Lanka is a post-mortem. But a good regulatory system would publish this information in advance. So what we should be seeing is year 2021 information now, and the forecast costs and the forecast revenue. So at least we have the historic, so let us be happy with it. So before looking at the details, we will look at the last line. Last line is Sri Lanka total cost of electricity production and delivery to customers. It was 14 rupees 90 cents and the customers paid 1368. Different customers paid different rates. And the subsidy that the government had to provide was 8% of the cost. Look what has happened by 2019. The subsidy that the government has to give to the sector was 24% of the cost. Now, the issue is the government does not give this subsidy. So therefore, the electricity suppliers have to cut down on their expenses. So what do they cut down? Obviously, they don't sack anybody. Nobody loses a job. Nobody's salary is reduced. Power plants have to be run. Renewables have to be purchased. Fuel has to be purchased. So the only thing that can be cut down are investments on the network. Investments on transmission and distribution, and in reliability improvement, in loss reduction, to improve the technical and commercial quality of the electric utility industry. So what suffers are the investments on the network. So I will not go into minute details of this chart. Let's look at the numbers in red. Households as a group, not any smaller group. Households as a group, the cost of supply was 25 rupees and they paid only 15. Subsidy for this group of customers was 40% of the cost. Other low voltage customers, the smaller commercial customers, the religious places, small industries, 14% of the cost. Bulk customers, small, medium industries, medium commercial buildings, 5% of the cost. Large bulk customers, big factories, there are about 200 customers there, big factories, big commercial buildings, 16%. So we ended up actually everybody being subsidized. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are some households that actually are not subsidized, basically the high user households. There are some LV customers, particularly the commercial sector customers. Remember this group of customers I showed in a previous slide. This group of customers, medium scale and large scale commercial users, are actually providing a contribution to the subsidy. So in a summary like this that I show in this slide, those subsidies provided by some customers are not visible, but in this grouping arrangement, everybody is subsidized, and therefore the sector needs 24% of its money coming from somewhere. That money does not come from somewhere because the government has no money. So therefore what happens is investment is cut back. So then the sector is being demanded by a lot of people, politicians, international agencies, to increase renewables, reduce use of fossil fuels. So let us look at what that means. First of all, how much renewables are we using today? So let us look at some recent data. I will skip this slide. I think I will skip this as well, but it will be there in your presentation. What share of electricity is produced from renewables? I looked at a data spectrum, and in 2020, it was 37%. And 2020 is listed as a year of not so good hydrology. Look at year 2013. In 2013, of course, the consumption was lower than today. Sri Lanka was able to meet 60% of its electricity requirement from hydropower. And the little bit of renewables that were there, almost a further 10% of electricity came from other renewables beyond hydros. Of course, if you look at the history, there were some politicians who took credit for making the sector profitable in 2014. But the real reason is not really any political wisdom. It is because the renewable energy share was very high. And therefore, the sector reported profits not only in 2014, but in 2015 as well. But we have to look at the reality when we plan and operate and critique a system. So therefore, this is the reality of the situation, and the share of renewable energy, as you see, the supply is growing, the demand is growing. 2020, there was a reduction in the electricity consumption as a whole. The reduction was about 3.2%. Hopefully that will diminish this year. But these are the realities, and we move on. So from the smaller power plants, smaller renewables, the range of small hydro, wind, solar, both rooftop, etc. So that contribution reached about 10% by 2015, and presently stands around 12 to 13%. It's not a huge share from new renewables. Before we move on further, we'll look at this as well. Sri Lanka, as I say here, consistently reports energy share and not capacity share from renewables. Because renewable share has become a slogan, I would now say that Sri Lanka would be better off if we report in terms of capacity, the share of renewables in terms of generating capacity. That's what India does. India reports renewable energy share in terms of capacity. So megawatt of renewable energy divided by megawatt of everything. Sri Lanka is already at 50%. But I've done a comparison. What if we reported capacity? We would have reported about 80% before 1995 and reported 100% in certain years on energy. But since we are, in my view, honestly reporting energy, because if we are to reduce the use of fossil fuels, we have to compare it in terms of energy, not capacity. So our energy share in 2020 was about 37% from renewables, whereas the capacity share was 50%. So that's Sri Lanka's achievement. So, but then we need to understand why the renewable energy share suddenly dropped from approximately 1995 to year 2000, a rapid reduction. The reason is that the demand continued to grow, households continued to be connected, whereas 1992 was the last major hydroelectric power plant. So after that, there was no major contribution from hydroelectrics, and therefore renewable share dwindled. That was expected, it was not a surprise. Of course, these are some summaries of information that may be useful to you. Then commenced a private sector-led renewable energy development program in 1996, which was called the Small Power Producer Program. Started off in 1996 as a standardized, non-negotiable agreement and pricing for anybody who develops a renewable energy project. So there were two pricing policies. One ran from 96 to 2007. While honoring the historic contracts, the pricing policy moved on to a cost-reflective policy in 2007. And presently about 250 such small power producers are in operation and providing about 10%, or last year it was about 11% of energy to the grid, electrical energy to the grid. Plus, of course, rooftop solar provided a further 2 to 3% of electrical energy to the grid. So that is the situation, how Sri Lanka started off with sometimes called non-conventional renewable energy. Sometimes they are called a new renewable energy. But in general, additions to large hydros was developed on this principle. Of course, 2008 was another milestone year when net metered renewable energy at customer premises was allowed. Before that, anybody wants to invest on a renewable energy project has to set up a project and establish a company, sign an agreement, get environmental approval. So they were projects. So having a micro power plant on your rooftop in the form of a solar PV, or if you are in a hydro area, a micro hydro power plant connected through your existing connection was allowed from 2008. So in 2008, when Sri Lanka allowed it, many of the countries in Asia and Southeast Asia had not allowed it. In fact, there are some countries who still don't allow net metered rooftop solar PV or any similar source of renewable energy. Of course, the 2008 declaration was upgraded in 2016 to allow for surplus energy to be sold to the distribution company who is serving you. So by 2020, about estimated 375 megawatt largely solar rooftops. A very small number of micro hydros were in operation on this principle of connecting to the network through an existing customer connection. Of course, what is important is that this 375 megawatt worked out to 8% of the power generating capacity in the country, but provided only 2% of energy. So what we have to be cautious is not to be misled by megawatt figures. So there will be headlines talking about megawatt, but bringing in much smaller quantities of energy. And to reduce fossil fuel energy and keep the industry going and customers' equipment going, what matters is energy, not capacity. Of course, capacity is also important. Of course, I always say that the economics of rooftop solar is generally misunderstood. I will briefly explain why I say so after some more background information. So this is how the small power producer program flourished in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is considered to be an example of encouraging private sector to produce electricity from renewable sources and participate in the electricity production process. But of late, Sri Lanka is considered to be not so good an example in getting private investments into the renewable energy industry. Of course, challenges exist in the renewable energy power plants. Some of them are engineering challenges, the linkage to the resource, for example, hydropower, seasonality of both hydro and wind power, as well as interannual variations. Interannual variations, you know what intermittency is, particularly solar and wind, and supply chain uncertainty for biomass, and their limited contribution to power system stability. So that, of course, is a subject that I will not go into great detail, but adequate for me to say that small renewable energy sources, and they are increasingly connected through electronics, do not contribute to power system stability in the conventional sense. So, of course, non-conventional power system stability is also being researched on. But right now, the situation is that more renewables means lower stability. But that may change in the future. But we have to work on the technology and the economics that are applicable now. So, as I always say, a lot of research is going on all the areas of renewables and batteries and managing the systems. But then there is a power system to be run. Lights have to be on until research and market forces bring in equipment and systems and technologies that will eventually replace the traditional way of managing the power system. Until then, lights have to be on. Uh, so let me move on, leaving you to study some of these points later. Sri Lanka's solid linkage of renewable energy generating system to irrigation. So this diagram is from a CEB document, and insight into interannual variations. So seniors in my audience will know that when we were heavily renewable, blackouts or load shedding or power cuts, whatever you call it, were a standard occurrence once in 3 to 4 years. So 1974, 1978, 1983, 1987, 1992, 1996 were historically blackout years. And now that we have a sizable capacity of thermal generation, in which the seasonality and interannual variations are not a problem, but price is a problem, the load shedding is a thing of the past, except for shorter windows in the recent history when there were major difficulties in terms of getting new capacity. So that, of course, is a subject for a later discussion. But the focus here are the limitations of renewables. This is a familiar diagram. Many of you would have seen the intermittency of a solar power generating system. And this is a diagram some of you may not have seen, the intermittency of a rooftop solar PV system, producing rated at 5 kilowatt and its output, and another location in Colombo on a 4 kilowatt system. So these intermittencies will have to be managed by the grid. So therefore, in the same way, the renewable developer has a right to be connected to the grid. Other customers also, and the solar PV customer also has a right for a regular supply of electricity from the grid. So the grid has to remain stable, and for which there have to be investments on the grid. I will skip this. Power system should be robust and flexible, and there should be redundancy, there should be smartness, there should be ability to fast recovery. We call it resilience. So the question is our power system resilient? Of course, I have some notes here, the traditional information, the need for uh, generation and customer demand to match. They have to match. And the only difference between the production and consumption should be the losses in the network. And if there is a mismatch, there will always be a problem in the system. So therefore, a weak power system as the one we have has very major frequency excursions, and which should not be there. The frequency violations per month run into hundreds of events per month. So therefore, Sri Lanka is a weak power system with a small amount of inertia, which means its own stored kinetic energy, and owing to financial reasons, a small amount of spinning reserve. So we have a weak system and not enough money to keep adequate spinning reserve, not perhaps sometimes not enough capacity to keep adequate spinning reserve. So earlier it was a matter of intermittency in customer demand and managing the seasonality and interannual variations of renewables. Now the grid has to increasingly manage all those plus intermittency of electricity production. So therefore, challenges are many. So let's move on. Coming back to the financial challenge, there are challenges with the existing renewable energy power plants. So these are calculations provided by the Public Utilities Commission. I will spend some time on this slide for year 2019. The total cost of producing a kilowatt hour energy only from oil burning power plants were 24 rupees and renewables was 19 rupees and rooftop solar was 22, and there was some generation, a small amount for which customers were paid. There was some crisis situations, that is 6 rupees, averaged at 1282. So that 1282 translates to here when you calculate on the basis of a kilowatt hour sold. So looking at this figure, 14 rupees 10, this is a national average for the whole year. If somebody is avoiding the use of a kilowatt hour, the value of that to the grid is 1410. So if somebody is producing electricity at more than 1410, that means such person is increasing the cost of electricity production in the grid. And even with 1410, the total cost of producing and delivering electricity was 2184 per kilowatt hour. These are not my calculations, Public Utilities Commission's calculations, and they approved it. So cost of supply 2184, but the actual average price of electricity, now 2019 data is published, is 1703. So anybody looking at this information would agree that anything that causes any of these numbers to increase will further aggravate 2184. So if we buy renewables at an average of 19 rupees or 22 rupees, it will further aggravate this figure, which is 1410. which is the generation energy cost. If there are more people who are employed unnecessarily in these two institutions, the transmission cost will go up, the distribution cost will go up. So anybody signing to purchase fuel from a source on which the pricing is not competitive, for example, the debate that is going on, will be causing an increase in this number. It will immediately impact the customers. So therefore, simply looking at these numbers, obviously the largest impact will be in case the generation cost goes up, because it is already high. So if somebody asks me internationally, are these numbers in the correct range? I would agree that this number is in the correct range. It is in the correct range. This number is also in the correct range. Distribution cost is not in the correct range. I would expect it to be 3 rupees. So there are savings in distribution costs. Now, what are distribution costs? Asset depreciation, that is related to the investment, and interest costs on investment on distribution, operation and maintenance, which includes staff salaries, spare parts, all other expenses. So out of these, most likely, what can be reduced are operation and maintenance expenses. So it's not only in generation, but in distribution expenses also, there are savings to be made to help bridge this gap. And the gap is getting wider year by year. So this is a different representation of the same data, looking at it again simplistically in an easy to understand way. The generation capacity is applicable for large hydro, coal, and oil. For small renewables, there are no capacity costs. But of course, these capacities are helping to support renewables. And you add the transmission expenses, the distribution expenses, and the fuel-related expenses. So therefore, in 2019, to produce a kilowatt hour from oil-fired generation and get it to your electricity meter, it costs 37 rupees. And producing a kilowatt hour next from renewables, that is mini hydro, wind, solar parks, solar rooftops, to produce that electricity and bring it to your doorstep, it costs 25 rupees. And you and I were asked to pay only 17 rupees. We used a lot of electricity from oil-fired generation. It was 36 rupees when it came to our meter. You and I were asked to pay only 17. From coal power, these are actual information. This is not my information, the PUC information. It was all inclusive 18 rupees. But you and I were asked to pay only 17 rupees. But there were profits made from large hydro. They cost only 8 rupees. And we were asked to pay 17 rupees. So, of course, as all countries do, there has to be a balancing act, such that the total cost in the last bar and the price matches. So therefore, we seem to be producing too much of this and too much of this at high prices, such that we are unable to bridge this gap between 17 rupees and 23 rupees. We will move on. Quickly, I may skip some of the slides of how you calculate the cost of supplying a particular technology. So I've lined up all the technologies here and the actual average cost of 2019. There are debates as to whether we should continue the rooftop solar PV program in the same manner that we continue now. So this is the 2016 calculation, and the 2016 calculation came with the result that they should be paid 22 rupees and 15.50 from 8 to 20th year. Now, once we go into a situation where renewable investments are decreasing in price, we see that as of early part of this year, we of course have to keep on adjusting it to exchange rate, that the return on investment are exorbitant. The return on investments are exorbitant to the level that a large rooftop solar PV system has a simple payback period of 2.6 years. Usually, these are very high figures compared with the rates that are experienced in Sri Lanka. So these are the calculated prices that are actually paid in the previous slide, and the prices that I would call a fair price. A fair price that will give a benefit to the investor on his rooftop and a reasonable payback period, because he's getting a guaranteed purchase for 20 years and is reasonable to the purchaser, thereby to the customer who finally uses that electricity as a customer. So as you see, 22, the fair price is 15 for a small customer. For a big solar PV system, it is paid 22, but our assessment as a fair price is 11 rupees. So that the payback periods are about 5 years and the return on equity is 16%. Return on equity is 16%. So return on equity 16% in the current context is a good return on equity. Of course, if the inflation goes to 15%, I would say, okay, return on equity must be 25%, but it has not been so for the last 10 years. This gives the structure of the approved cost. I will not go into a lot of detail. This is a historic spread for the last 10 years ending 2019. There are emerging challenges, varying customer loads. You might wonder why I put a crane in the ports in this picture, because that's the only example I had of a severely varying demand. So when a crane lifts a container, it draws power up to a max of about 1,000 kilowatt, 1 megawatt. But when it lowers the box, it could be returning about 500 kilowatt back to the system. So, and the intermittency is very high, and these markings are in 1 minute intervals. So it goes up in a minute, and in the next minute it comes down. So intermittency of loads is increasing. Intermittency of production is increasing. The line voltages in LV systems are increasing above the 242, which is the 243, which is the regulatory max that one could allow on a distribution network. This was a measurement not done recently, but in 2017. It was already violating the 243 by 10 volt middle of the day. Reason, rooftop solar PV. Are we going to live with this or bring in a solution for this? So LV network strengthening, smart meters, battery storage, tap changing transformers, many researchers have proposed, analyzed, but we need to bring in solutions that are working on the ground. It could be one of these or many of these. But then to bring solutions to financial constraints as well as the technical constraints, there has to be correct pricing of rooftop solar PV. So, of course, there is competitive bidding going on for wind and solar investments outside the rooftops. But looking at what's happening in rooftops is something that requires a correction now that the promotional period is over. Uh, you remember that I presented a calculation of 11 rupees to be a fair price for a megawatt scale rooftop solar PV. Do not misunderstand. This is not the system in your roof. It's a megawatt scale, and we do have megawatt scale rooftop solar PV coming in. The fair price is 11, but we are paying 22, which was the promotional price announced in 2016. So as you and I would agree, the carnival cannot go on forever. We must get back to reality. So what is happening is that large industrial customers are selling all their product to the grid at a premium price, which I would say is double what it is worth, and purchasing subsidized electricity again at 11 rupees, a commodity that is worth 18 rupees. That was 2019 cost of supply to an industry. But nationally, this figure was 22 rupees. But industries being bulk customers and largely daytime customers, the cost of supply to a large industry was about 18 rupees. So this correction we have to do, incentive here and incentive here. So that does not work, because what will happen is that this brings in undue advantage to some customers and thereby reduce the quality of the grid, because this reduces amount of money available for investment on particularly distribution. Competition has brought in very good results, as I would summarize here. I think I have to close very soon. I will close in about 5 minutes. As I said, until about 2013, renewable energy pricing for projects, not the rooftop, for projects went on a fixed price, what is known as a feed-in tariff. And that was discontinued, and perhaps the last feed-in tariff power plant that was connected was in 2017. And since 2015, competitive bidding commenced. And a good example for wind power, a 10 megawatt power plant, commissioned in 2015 on fixed pricing was 2344. 5 years later, a competitively bid power plant, 5 years later, with the rupee depreciated from possibly about 150 rupees to 200 rupees, and many other changes. After so many years, the competitively bid power plant is today producing at approximately 1250. It is slightly higher than that, but we are waiting for information for 2020 to be published. So this was the target price. The actual must be slightly higher than this. So 2344 versus 1250. What brought in that reduction? Competition. Solar PV. Fixed price commissioned in 2017 went for to 2310. This was signed well before 2017. Now being paid 2310. Competitive bidding brought it down to 1795. So similar sized. In fact, these are smaller. So in comparative terms, this is a big solar power plant. This is a small solar power plant, but still, it is 5 rupees cheaper. And more recent bids, which have not been published yet, we are waiting for data to be published for 2020, will throw more light on what are the results of competitive bidding. So renewables need to move to competitive bidding. Not only renewables, the Electricity Act says all purchases to the grid and even the pay-per-click purchased by the electric utility has to be on a competitive basis, because that is the only way that the customer can be dealt with fairly, that he's getting a product from a monopoly industry an industry that is a natural monopoly that is getting a product at a fair price. So therefore, from time to time, these fixed price mechanisms and negotiated mechanisms, both for renewable energy and as we see recently for fossil fuels, the gas is also coming our way. But the data uh, of real life competition is very clear that competition delivers justice to the project as well as to the customers. I have a few more slides, but I will conclude with this slide that there are many challenges to the sector, and these challenges would have to be resolved. And the order of magnitude of the group of these challenges, managing renewable energy purchases, managing sector finances, the total savings to the energy sector, the broader energy sector, is of the order of about $1,000 million a year. That includes the refinery, which Sri Lanka is struggling to build for the last 20 years. So the energy sector, if these are the realities and if my number is closer to the actual that is happening, the energy sector in Sri Lanka is worth about $5,000 million. So what I'm saying is there is a potential to save $1,000 million out of it through a variety of actions, reducing network losses, reducing distribution costs, competitive purchase of electricity to the grid, building a refinery, a variety of actions. So we are running a suboptimal energy sector in this country, and the suboptimality is costing us about 20% of the value of the sector, which is due money to the customers. So that's my last slide, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siyabalapitiya. So now it's time for questions. Either you can put the question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask the question.
Dr. Tilak Siyabalapitiya, I am Prasanna Gunawardhan from University of Peradeniya.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very informative presentation about the electricity scenario in Sri Lanka for bidding process of. But how about the other, because the oil, they're still using more than renewables, the other sector is more eating money than the other renewables in that sense. So how about that one? So what are the remedies to, because the oil power plants are very expensive, it seems, is that because of the nature of that one, or they are making higher profits, or what?
Well, I'm trying to stop the share just a moment. Yes, your question was whether oil is being produced, oil-fired electricity generation is producing at above the cost, whether it is inherent feature of oil-fired generation, or whether we are paying too much. Yeah. In fact, strictly speaking, we should not be producing any electricity from oil. If you take the long-term plan 10 years ago or 20 years ago, for today, it would have shown the oil-fired electricity generation will be about 5% or 4%. So, but we seem to be a country that keeps on changing policies and not fully understanding it. And these policy changes from every now and then finally lands us in a situation where there is no other option but to either purchase from private power producers, oil-fired generation, or run existing oil-fired power plants, which should have been retired long time ago, by pumping oil into them. These power plants could be privately owned or CB owned. So why do we get into that situation? I will later talk about the cost. We get into that situation because of abrupt policy changes, as well as problems related to procurement. It has actually nothing to do with renewables or inability of renewables or anything. It's largely related to procurement related issues, as well as abrupt changes in policies. So if the plan that was in place in 2015 was allowed to proceed, and if there were no abrupt policy changes or I don't mind saying manipulation of the procurement process, we would have had a gas terminal today. We would not be producing electricity from oil, but producing from gas together with a coal-fired power plant in Trincomalee. So that was the plan, but that doesn't mean that there was no plan for renewables. Renewable plan was already there, but it was not targeted to be 50% or 70%, but the targets were there. I think it was 20% by 2020. So we have not reached the renewable target of 20% for this year because it was not diligently pursued. We have not reached the target of doing away with oil-fired power generation and getting gas into the country. And we have failed to build the Trincomalee power plant as well. Finally, after failing in all these three, the quick solution is something that we always go, that is oil-fired generation. So some of these contracts are being extended eternally, for 1 year or 3 years, etc. Plus existing power plant, which should have been retired long time ago, or which should have been doing only backup duties under emergencies, are being pushed to run flat out. So therefore, last year, even with a slump in demand of 3.2%, we produce 27% of our electricity from oil, way above the 13% we produce from small renewables. So wind, solar, rooftops, everything together, mini hydro, we managed to muster only 13% at a higher price. But even at a higher price, double that quantity of electricity coming from oil. So the reason is abrupt policy changes and the procurement process for the gas terminal that was, I would say, totally disrupted by the government, the past government, I would say. And I don't know whom to blame, but this is the reality, and it is a recurring cycle. So it happens once every 5 years, sometimes goes longer than 5 years. So if you look at 2015 electricity production, oil share was 15%. So 15% was not so good. It should have gone down further, but it has been going up and up and up to reach 27 last year. It would have been about 32% if not for COVID. Fortunately for COVID, we saved 5% of electricity coming from oil. So that's the reality. But there are some unfavorable contracts for certain private sector oil power plants as well. And some of CEB's oil burning power plants are very old and cannot be classified as efficient. So they are not energy efficient. We should have retired them quite some time ago.
Yeah, Dr. Siyabalapitiya, thank you very much.
Yes.
And I can understand what you mean, but it would have been better that if you are likely, now you have compared the targeted, the solar could be generated by 11 rupees or half the price. So likewise, if you have figures like now the old or any other already running oil power plants, and what will be the tariff that you are really or suggesting to purchase, because it is very high. So my question was really, is it because of the oil prices or otherwise the bad contract or whatever? So that was my thinking.
Yes,
so if you have very old power plants, they would have taken all the invested money. Now they are just running it. If that is the cost is high because of the oil, then no problem. I mean, we don't have any controls. But otherwise, it is a big burden.
That's right. In terms of, say, if you look at the fleet of oil power plants that are running, CEB Kalnitissa is operational, but CEB Kalnitissa combined cycle, I think, is out of order right now. That is the most efficient power plant in the CEB fleet, is out of order, sadly, right, for quite a long period. I hope it's up and running now. But then CEB Sapugaskanda is not so efficient, but it is CEB. So there are no capacity charges or profits to be paid to anybody. But AES Kalnitissa is operational, but their capacity charges are not too bad in the numbers that I have seen. But Ceylon, the power plant that is in news, that has a fairly high capacity charge. So that is what may have attracted this investor, so that his returns will have to be given in dollars. So although there is a lot of enthusiasm about that sale. Anyway, there is a oil burning power plant in Siyabalapitiya, which had a 10-year contract that ended in 2015. It should have been retired, but it is still running on short-term contract extensions. The next, you can imagine when Sri Lanka is in a fix and we are short of capacity, even 100 megawatt is of great value to Sri Lanka. So prices will be dictated by that owner. And technically speaking, you are right. Siyabalapitiya power plant capital costs, the electricity customers in this country have fully paid over the 10-year window of 2005 to 2015. So anything more produced from that power plant should only entail maintenance costs, lube oil cost, and fuel cost. So it should not have any profits, but obviously I'm sure there are profits built into these numbers. So partly unfavorable contracts, partly inefficient power plants, particularly those in the CEB fleet, because there is no other option, and partly because it is oil, because as we all know, it uses at least a quarter of a liter of oil to produce electricity. So if diesel is 120, quarter of a liter is 1/4 of that is 20 rupees. So you need 20 rupees to produce a kilowatt hour from diesel these days.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prasanna. I can see Dr. Kamalanath has raised his hand. Dr. Kamalanath?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Desha. Now, Dr. Siyabalapitiya Kamalanath here.
Yes, Dr.
Now, one thing now, the countries like the developed countries like UK and other countries, they are having this real-time bidding when purchasing power, and also long-term contract between the producer and the consumer without going through the utility. So I don't think we can recommend this for the present situation. But what do you think about that kind of model?
Well, I would say yes, we need to go into market-based principles. Even India went to market-based principles probably more than 10 years ago. I think 2009, right? So what India did was basically they had power purchase agreements to supply about 80 to 85% of the requirement. And for the balance requirement, they started the bidding process. So India is divided into 5 regional grids. So at the regional level, there is a bidding round published at 11 a.m. every day, saying that for the southern grid, that includes Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, etc., there is a requirement for, let us say, 300 megawatt at 10 a.m., 350 megawatt at 11 a.m., like that. Okay. So therefore, people who have power plants, who may have an extra generator for which he does not have a long-term contract, or he was on maintenance, but he finished his maintenance earlier. So therefore, he can come up and supply tomorrow's demand. So there was a market mechanism. There is a market mechanism still operating in India. So in spite of the fact that most of the Indian electricity distributors were loss-making, India brought in the competition into generation, short-term competition. So therefore, that itself brought in a reduction in prices, In addition, of course, competitive bids were going on for large-scale power plants. So I think as late as about 3 years ago, or as late as even last month, Tamil Nadu issued a bid for a large coal-fired power plant. So those things are also going on to send the message to the bidders that look, the government is also in the business, and that keeps a check on the prices. So that worked out very well for India. Of course, India puts solar and wind also on competitive bidding. There are hardly any fixed price contracts on renewables in most places of India. Even if it is there, they will be very low. I think rooftop solar PV is attracting about something like 5 US cents or 4.5 US cents in some states. So there are fixed price mechanisms. So in my view, we should go in for a competitive market, but we should also be cautious that there will be no runaway situation, as it happened in California, where everybody tries to play in the short-term market, but at the end, nobody to build power plants to to hold the system together, to provide the ancillary services, to get the spinning reserve, to get the reactive power on. So we have to be cautious that there is a balancing mechanism so that the mainstream power plants, whatever combined cycle gas fired or large hydro or whatever, possibly no major hydros anymore, they are also built so that the balancing power can be provided by the mainstream power plant. So India does it by making sure that by continuing with their nuclear power development program and continuing with their coal power development program, so that this short-term market will not be dominated by oil-fired power plants. Because if they don't go ahead with their nuclear and coal-fired and other gas-fired projects, because as we know very well, it is cheap to install oil power plants. So the capital cost of oil power plant, as we all know, is about 1/3 of that of a coal-fired power plant, or half of that of a combined cycle power plant. So investment is smaller, and people will start playing in the short-term market with oil-fired generation, and the purchaser, CEB, will have no option but to buy oil-fired generation today. At least that is at a predefined price, but it might go to double the price, 3 times the price. So therefore, that will cause immediate bankruptcy of CEB. That happened in a very famous case in California several years ago, when the regulator said, yeah, there everything is private, but the regulator let it loose, saying that anybody can bid and go in. So nobody built power plants for the larger scale, and everybody was playing in the short-term market until such time California had blackouts, because there was no money by the utilities to pay. So therefore, we need a cautious entry to the system. And it is beautiful that if that entry can come in with renewables, because renewables are still, in my view, incremental to our system, except for large wind power plants. So until batteries become cheaper, renewables can come in as the incremental contributor, which will cut back the oils. So then CEB and the government will also, if they are analyzing it properly, when they get a bid for renewables, for example, if it is 18 rupees, they must analyze why. Oh, renewables are bidding at 18 because they know we have no other option but to go for oil at 25 rupees. So we have to be cautious on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Siyabalapitiya. And I mean, given the market manipulation in Sri Lanka, I don't know how we can.
You need to have a very strong regulatory setup. In India, the regulators are very strong and in most part very honest. Yeah. So I've spoken to regulators, I've looked at their analysis, and they are timely, everything is published, and even if a utility is making a mistake, just take the losses. If the regulator says, I will allow you only 15% loss, and he is following up on that. So likewise, although most of it is still government owned, except for I think about 4 distribution utilities, everything is directly or indirectly government owned. But the government regulator is strongly managing the government owned grid. So, but we don't have that kind of a strong and independent regulation in this country. And it's not only the regulator, but the political system also has not made up their mind to let the industry be regulated according to the rules and regulations, in which there is a owner who is the government for most of the sector assets, but not all. And there is an operator who is the CEB, and there is a regulator who is the PUC. So each party does its job, and the government also makes policy. So policy is the government, owner is the treasury, which is okay, the government, but not exactly the government for some of the assets, not all. And the operator is CEB, LECO, and all their entities within. And the regulator is PUC. So if all these players play according to the book of rules which have been written, it is there, the act is there, the guidelines are there, the regulations are there for reliability, loss reduction, tariff, pricing, costing, for everything there are regulations. But all the players are not playing according to the rules.
Yeah, thank you. One last question, Dr. Siyabalapitiya. Now,
Yeah.
CEB, I mean, government has decided not to allow CEB to develop thermal plant about, I think, 2008 or
Yeah.
so. So is it still applying or?
Well, these are abrupt policy changes from time to time. So we have a new political authority that came in 2019 with 300 megawatt more at Portland. And suddenly 1 year later, they themselves say, no, please stop, right? And 1 week later, you have a investor flying in from USA proposing a gas power plant and gas terminal. So, so these abrupt changes in policy finally makes things very unclear. So there may be another political authority coming in 2025 and asking CEB, why are you not developing thermals? Look, India is developing. There are 3 major coal power plants and 1 nuclear power plant under construction in Tamil Nadu itself, very close to Sri Lanka, plus a lot of renewables, sure, wind and solar. So Tamil Nadu is surplus in energy now and building up more surpluses. So therefore, these inconsistencies in policies and ad hoc changes in policies without calculating the impacts. So whatever decisions I would have preferred, okay, if the government says no more large thermal power plants, then there should have been a spreadsheet. Onto that spreadsheet, from that spreadsheet, you remove the next thermal power plant and find the impact on the costs of electricity and the treasury and the balance of payments in the country. Government should be having that spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet that looks at the 10-year window of the electricity sector. So if I can do it, I'm sure the CEB and the government and the regulator can have much better insight into what exactly are the implications, and then get ready to face those implications. So finally, our situation is that decisions are made which are not exactly according to the law or the energy policy. So say, for example, the energy policy says that the gas supply and the gas terminal and the pipeline will be 3 different entities. Energy policy 2019, Parliament approved energy policy written in black and white. It's not a political document, it's an official document of the government. But now we hear that the same company is going to handle all the 3. So these abrupt changes in the policy, and finally we might find come 2025, we have no other thermal power plants, we have no new coal-fired power plants, and the gas terminal company has gone back to USA, and we have no gas terminal, and renewables have muddled along, possibly reaching about 45%, and probably oil accounting for about another 40% of electricity production. That will be a tragedy. And the way things are moving, and with the experience of more than 35 years in the sector, I foresee that even by 2025, we will still be producing a huge amount of electricity from oil. Sadly, it will not be renewables, or it will not be even LNG, because the approach is not correct.
Thank you very much.
There's another question in the chat box. Dr. Siyabalapitiya, one Chandan is asking, what is your thinking on unbundling the vertically integrated utilities by bringing structural reforms as tried in 2000? Can
Yes,
we make an interference on the increasing trend on transmission losses and reliability issues to the connecting highly intermittent solar and wind?
Yes, I think the question is in two parts. The first one is on unbundling, which is really a administrative and ownership issue. So, in fact, the new Electricity Act of 2009 provides for functional unbundling. It does not provide for selling off or setting up separate companies. Sri Lanka has been very national minded to the effect that all these the electricity entities should be owned by the government, and those sentiments were still very strong when the Electricity Act went through the parliament, ending up in 2009, which approved the Electricity Act, which had provisions for functional unbundling, which means although it is the same entity, CEB would be operating as 6 different business entities, 1 for generation, 1 for transmission, 4 for distribution. So if you look at the internal structure of CEB, all that has been done. There are 6 different business lines, 6 different CEOs, 6 different staff are aligned to each one of these business lines. The only thing that did not happen is actually functional unbundling. So that part did not happen. So therefore, the expectations of the Electricity Act of 2009 in bringing in accountability to the business of electricity production, transmission, and delivery has not been achieved. So therefore, but if I give you an example, it was expected that, say for example, CB transmission is given a target network loss of 2.3%. So if 2.3% is not achieved and it hits 2.8%, there's a 0.5% undue energy loss in the transmission network. So that 0.5% undue energy loss will not be paid by anybody. Customers will not pay, generators will not pay. The equivalent energy value of that 0.5%, which incidentally amounts to about 2,000 million rupees, will have to be taken out from the transmission entity's account. So what will suffer? Transmission division engineers will not get a bonus in that year. So this was the expected benchmark competition that was expected to be brought in. But sadly, both the regulator, PUC, and the regulated have not responded to this kind of a benchmark regulatory arrangement. So structural reforms could have been done if all parties were honest. All parties, I mean everybody, or including the customers, were honest and understanding that functional unbundling, let it happen for a while, and thereafter, if we want to unbundle it further, unbundling the ownership as well, let's do that later. So, of course, countries that have privatized the electricity industries have also got bitter experiences. So I'm not saying that privatization has all good and nothing bad elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world, particularly, there have been very, very difficult situations in other countries. So that's my response to the first question. Can we make an inference on the increasing trend on transmission losses and reliability issues to the connecting highly intermittent solar and wind? No, I cannot attribute the increasing losses to intermittency, but I will someday have to attribute the increasing losses, some of the increasing losses, to rooftop generation at LB level, but not yet. Our analysis indicate that the rooftop solar PV generation at low voltage level has to be a lot more widespread, maybe almost every other house having 5 kilowatt on their rooftop along the street. Then, in addition to that, if that area does not have a substantial daytime electricity consumption, almost all that electricity throughout the day has to travel the LV network incurring losses of the order of about 3% during daytime and reach the medium voltage network. So someday I will attribute anything substantial to particularly distributed rooftop solar PV, but I cannot attribute the increasing losses to either intermittency or to wind and solar to any extent. But increasingly our renewable energy production, electricity production from renewable energy will have to travel from north to south. So therefore, I would expect not a substantial, but a calculated increase in the transmission losses in the next 5 years. But otherwise, we should be able to manage the distribution losses at levels lower than what we are reporting now.
There's one last question from one Kirti. Why Sri Lanka not considered about nuclear power solution? Is it because of safety maintenance issues or some other reasons?
Well, I cannot give a qualified answer because I'm not a person who's holding any authority on the subject. So I can only make or only tell you what has happened in the past and previous attempts and where we are now, plus my personal opinion. Briefly, Sri Lanka started off with a, I would say, a reconnaissance study in the 1990s as to how Sri Lanka should prepare for a possible commencement of a nuclear program. So as you know, Sri Lanka even does not have a test reactor. Sri Lanka does not have a test reactor even for research purposes. Although there are a lot of nuclear technology being used in medicine as well as in testing and all that. So, but no activities on power. So off and on, there have been expert committees appointed to review the policy, advise the government on policy, but none of them have ever recommended a drive towards building a nuclear power plant. So that's what has gone in the history. To my knowledge, there is nothing happening to advance the idea of building a nuclear power plant. So your question has a second section in which whether I think the safety is a problem. So I would refuse to accept that fact that safety and ability of Sri Lankans to be trained and the ability of Sri Lankans to maintain the nuclear power plant, I have no question about it. Sri Lankans are capable. Of course, we will definitely have to get international support because the nuclear technology has advanced so much. There will be no possibility of doing it on our own. But then once we get into the technology, once we are familiar, trained, people are there, engineers, scientists, it needs a lot of scientists. It's not only an engineering job, plus a lot of medical personnel as well. So when people are trained and put into the job, they will do it. The only concern I have about going in for nuclear is the large investment. And although I'm not concerned about the probability of a accident, I'm concerned about the potential damages from an accident in terms of its monetary value. So Fukushima was the last major accident. There are various reports how much the cleaning up costs. So cleaning up, there are reports of $5 billion, some damages paid. Some reports talk about $25 billion. So if you take a middle figure of say $12.5 billion, 12,500 million, so you will understand that our economy will be devastated by that kind of an accident. So I'm not saying that there will be an accident. The probability of an accident is very small, but if it happens, the impact on our economy will be devastating to the economy. So if I have any objection to nuclear, that is the only objection I have, but everything else is positive. It's good on greenhouse gases. But I have another small objection as well, because to secure the technology, we will have to align with one of the countries that have the technology. So it could be Russia, it could be Japan, it could be USA, it could be one of the European countries, particularly UK or Germany. These are the countries that are running nuclear power plants. And from recently, South Korea as well. South Korea are now planning to export their medium-sized reactor technology. They've already done. So therefore, we will have to align with a country for the technology and most likely for the fuel as well. So that is a secondary concern that I have, in addition to the major damage to the economy in case there's a disaster. But everything else is positive. In terms of technology, our ability to manage the long-term benefits of low-priced electricity, etc., etc. So everything else is positive. But a final decision has to weigh all these aspects, and perhaps government thinking of or even initiating a discussion on it have to consider many stakeholder views, including including the risks to the economy, as well as the areas where this can be located perhaps, and the capital required to do that. Also the fact that economies much larger than Sri Lanka have not gone in for nuclear power. Singapore, Malaysia, large economies. Indonesia is building a nuclear power plant. Bangladesh is building a nuclear power plant. India has nuclear, but economies that are larger than ours, many of them have not gone in for nuclear power. So need to study why they decided not to do so as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siyabalapitiya. I think on behalf of the Department of Mechanical Engineering, the Open University of Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science /Section C and the EUSL-Energy project, I would like to thank you for being with us. That was really informative, and that was marvelous. And we are honored to listen to you once again, because last year also we arranged a guest lecture like this, and hopefully we'll be arranging more lectures with you, because I can see people wants to ask many questions from you, and the thing is we're running out of time. Therefore, thank you very much once again, and everyone who participated today's webinar. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a pleasant night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will send you the presentation and you can distribute it to the YouTube.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, sir.
Right.
Thank you very much.